got a couple to start for you, Kate, with testing. So let's start with, is there a deadline to take the GMAT or the GRE before each round?
Great, thanks, Laurel. So there's no actual deadline in taking the test. I will say, though, that the deadline for admission is September 15th for round 1, and then obviously in January for round 2 and April for round 3. We do also have what's called our materials deadline, which typically happens a few days after that application deadline. And so we're looking to have your test scores by that date. Now we get asked a lot, can I take the test again and submit that after the deadline and after that materials deadline? And the answer is yes, you can. You're welcome to update your application at any point throughout the round that you applied in and up until the decision and release date. However, we can't guarantee that we'll see those test scores after that materials deadline. So our encouragement to you is to submit your application, like Laurel said, when you're most ready to do so. So and that includes having that test score that you really, really want. If it's within a couple days of the deadline, that's typically pretty fine, but really the encouragement should be to submit when you're ready.
I think there's a lot of increased anxiety around testing this year just because of the unusual circumstances and the existence of the online test. I'll say, as precedent, we tried as a team to be incredibly flexible in the past application cycle as you and we were navigating all of these changes to the testing process. And so right now, there is, in most geographies, reliable online testing options available. So our hope is that you're finding those accessible and that you'll be able to proceed. And we as a team, our commitment is to reviewing those scores as we would any other testing score. But this is just to say this should not be an additional source of anxiety for you. Were there to be some major disruption or major change to things, we as a team would obviously take that into consideration and communicate any changes to the policy. But as Kate said, your best bet right now is always to plan to have those tests done in advance of the deadline so that you can confidently submit your application and know that what we'll be reviewing on day 1 is exactly what you want us to see. Let's see. Related to testing as well, but a little bit more broadly into academics, how can a candidate further showcase their quantitative ability apart from their GMAT or GRE?
Yeah, that's a great question, and certainly one we get all the time from applicants. There are certainly things you can do. Obviously, if you're done with your undergraduate at this point for most of you, unless you're a Silver Scholar. So if you don't have any of those quantitative courses that you took in undergrad, some of you may, some of you don't. That's okay. One thing that is really helpful to students, even just kind of as you're preparing to join an MBA program, regardless of whether you've taken the courses or not, sometimes taking a refresher can be really helpful. So certainly that comes in many forms. Certainly there's opportunities for you to take more of a survey course that really gives you just kind of the fundamentals of the business school education. You can take a deeper dive as well, especially if you're worried about your quantitative preparedness. Maybe taking a statistics course would be super helpful to you. Maybe taking a microeconomics course would be really helpful to you. And you can take those obviously online as well. And just showing the admissions committee that you're really committed to this and you understand kind of where maybe your weaknesses lie in the application is also really helpful to us and really shows kind of that you've really thought through that process.
Thank you, Kate. I'm going to stay with you for a couple more questions related to work experience. Let's start with, when you say that you evaluate work experience in terms of quality rather than quantity, what do you mean by that? What is it that we're evaluating when it comes to quality?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And so again, a lot of applicants kind of, we talk about leadership and we talk about kind of the ability to lead. And a lot of students get a little nervous about this because they think it means that, they've had this kind of formal managerial role. And the truth is that, a lot of applicants, when they're applying to us with 3, 4, 5 years of work experience, they haven't had that opportunity to have a formal, managerial role where they actually have people working for them. And that's okay. So when we say leadership and kind of the things that we're looking for there, and when we talk about quality, we're looking for, students that, step in when they're needed. If, somebody can't make it to the meeting, they're the ones that step in and, they take over. We're looking for people who are able to kind of contribute to their teams. You know, Laurel mentioned this, you know, they know when to contribute and they know when to kind of maybe take a back seat on the team as well. And so we're kind of looking for evidence of all of this. Obviously, you know, as you tell it to us in your resume, kind of, you know, maybe quantifying those impacts that you've made through your organization, but we're also looking for a lot of that in those letters of recommendation.
Great. Another question about work. How can a candidate note that they've received a promotion in their job if there's no change in title? And I'll broaden that question a little bit to how can a candidate update us to the status of their work more generally if that changes over the course of the application process?
Yeah, no, that's another great question. And so a lot of this, in terms of updating us, I'll start with that. Because I mentioned it already before with test scores. Once you submit your application to us, you have this really nice little status page that you can reference at any point, again, throughout the round. And so on this status page, there's actually a little form that you can complete to update us with any additional information that you have. And I think a change in work circumstances is obviously a really, really good one that you want to highlight. And so if you were given a promotion at any time after the deadline or after you've submitted your application to us, you can submit that to us and it'll go right to your application. So the admissions committee will see it. In terms of, you know, you have a promotion, but maybe by just kind of looking at it, looking at your resume, you know, we won't be able to necessarily understand that it is a promotion. You're certainly welcome to mention that in the optional essay if you'd like. It's also great if your recommender can talk to that as well. Again, we're looking for the recommenders to tell us about your work progression, and sometimes it's not as easy to understand for certain organizations. It's not as linear, and so the recommender, we really lean on them to kind of talk about the fact that you're punching above your weight, even though maybe your salary hasn't increased or your title hasn't increased.
Great, thanks. I'm going to bounce over to Jared for a little while. A question about the essay. I like this one. How much do you recommend we incorporate our interest in the MBA and SOM specifically into the application, and specifically the essay questions?
Sure. Okay. Yeah. And thank you for asking that. I mean, I think especially as you consider the sort of the peer field of, you know, essay questions that are asked, you may notice that perhaps we don't ask a question of why SOM. You know, so there are things that may, to, you know, many candidates seem to be missing. So I will say the essay sometimes can lend itself, depending on what you pick, to talking about why SOM or what your goals are. It could lend to any number of questions. But I would really encourage you to focus on the core part of the question, which is describe the biggest commitment you've ever made. Try not to overthink it. You know, I think it's, especially when there's one essay question, it can be very enticing to try to get all of that into a very short amount of space. But you know, to the extent that you can, trust us. We have really constructed the application to try to answer those questions. And to some extent too, we will talk about some of those other pieces in the interview. And perhaps in the video questions as well. So really try to focus your space in the essay to answer that specific question.
And with that, question about the interview. When should I expect to hear about an interview?
Sure. And so we interview throughout the rounds. Your interview invitation could come, and they'll always come by email, but it could come as early as the deadline. So we don't start reading applications before the deadline, but we will start immediately at the deadline with reading applications. So it could come very quickly after the deadline. But then we do interview throughout the rounds, and totally transparently, you know, we in most rounds will make some interview invitations in the very final days right before decisions are to be released. So hang in there. We are trying to get through applications as quickly and efficiently as possible, but could come anytime throughout the rounds. I will mention that we don't make offers of admission without interviewing candidates, but we do waitlist candidates without interviewing sometimes. And so hypothetically, if we get all the way up to decision deadline and you still have not got an interview, it may be that you're being waitlisted and you may interview in a future round. So similar advice, which is to hang in there.
Great. A question about the video questions, a little more of a procedural one. So is the submission deadline for the video questions and the behavioral assessment different from the submission deadline for the application?
Great, yeah, and thank you for asking. I think that's a help to a lot of candidates who, have this question. We do typically give you a few days to resolve any kind of materials that may be beyond that pushing submit button. So this includes the video questions, behavioral assessment. Maybe you have a recommender who was out of the country or incapacitated in some regard, and we will remind you that there are certain parts of your application that are outstanding and give you a little bit of leniency in trying to get those in. So I believe, and my colleagues can correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's 3 days that we formally give you to resolve the video questions and the behavioral assessment after the application deadline. That does mean, and we don't sort of bean count on this in terms of if you submit your application a month before the deadline, we don't give you just 3 days. We just have it be 3 days after the deadline for all candidates.
And those dates should be posted on the application page itself next to the application deadlines. And it is helpful to keep in mind if you're going to be somewhere without connectivity, it may influence sort of the timing of when you push submit on your application. So do be mindful of those. I'll take a couple of questions that are maybe a little bit more atmospheric. So I have a question. How is COVID impacting the way you approach admissions in the upcoming application cycle? It's a good question. And in many ways, even though our day-to-day lives are massively impacted by what's going on right now, I don't actually anticipate major changes to the way in which you are applying to our program and the way in which we're evaluating your candidacy. Our application process has remained largely the same year over year from last year to this year. As Jared mentioned, we'll be conducting, at least for the first round, definitively, all of our interviews over Zoom versus having an on-campus interview program or going out to hub locations throughout the world. Perhaps an upside of that is I actually believe that we will be able to offer even more of you interviews with second-year students versus members of the admissions staff, which I actually think is an even better experience for you because it gives you an additional touch point within the community. And so I think the maybe silver lining of the Zoom format is our ability to do that. As I mentioned before, we'll continue to be flexible in understanding what the landscape looks like in terms of testing and other things that may be inhibited due to COVID, being able to get a transcript in as timely as a fashion. And so I think we'll continue the flexibility that we've already begun to demonstrate through the back half of this prior application cycle. I think maybe some of the other things that we'll just be more mindful of have to do with the circumstances you may find yourself in. So obviously, COVID has had a huge impact on the employment landscape. More of you might find yourself out of work or between jobs or transitioning to different sorts of roles than you found yourself in. And so we certainly understand that. It will continue to be helpful for you to explain your circumstances. I mean, that's a perfect use of an optional statement. If you have had sort of an unusual employment circumstance over the course of the past several months, that's important for us to know about. That's something that you can certainly share with us. But I think we'll be understanding of that, and we'll probably view current employment circumstances through a little bit of a different lens than we might in a typical application year. But by and large, I hope you'll find the process will look mostly the same. Obviously, your opportunities to engage with us will look a little bit different and much more virtual. But aside from that, I think the process will be largely the same. A perhaps related question to that, and a good one, is will deferrals from the 2020 application cycle affect the 2021 application cycle and intake? And we're still marching onwards to orientation day. So we don't have sort of the final view yet of the class that will be joining us shortly. But what I can say is, by and large, you should not be worried about the deferrals coming into the class, sort of taking up seats that would otherwise be available to you. We still have plenty of room in the class for talented candidates from all geographies and all backgrounds and industries to come into the class. We will likely even have room to make adjustments to the class size, assuming that the pool will support more admissions. I expect to be able to make to kind of have as much room in the class to offer space in the coming year as we have in a typical year. So I wouldn't worry about this not being a good year to apply, because I thought that all of the seats have been taken. So I hope that can help kind of put those thoughts at ease. I have a couple of scholarship related questions that I'm hoping Valerie can help answer. So for a merit-based scholarship, what aspects of the application are considered? So how do we think about merit in assigning scholarships?
So like Kate mentioned before, it is a very holistic process. So we really do look at all aspects of your application and, compare, your strength as an applicant to all of the other applicants in the pool. And in terms of, just so you get a sense of how many scholarships are awarded, we do award about 40 to 50% of the applicants who are admitted scholarship funding. And so to answer that question very broadly, using the hot word of the day, it is a holistic process. And so we look at all aspects of your application.
And the follow-up to that, are there differences in scholarship availability throughout the cycle?
Well, I mean, it's definitely advantageous, I would say, if you apply in round 1 or 2, as there are more scholarship funding available in those rounds. But that doesn't mean that there isn't scholarship funding in round 3. It just means that you're kind of at the mercy of the amount of students who have already admitted, matriculated, accepted their scholarship offers in the prior rounds. But we do have many students who apply in round 3 who are certainly eligible for scholarship funding. So I wouldn't discourage you from applying from round 3 for that reason.
I'll try to fit in just a couple more questions before the hour is up. I'll give this one to Kate. It's about letters of recommendation. What would you say is the #1 shortcoming you see in letters of recommendation that could be prevented by a better conversation between the applicants and recommender?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm glad you're asking that. So I think one of the things that we see a lot is there's a lot of really beautiful language in the letter of recommendation, but there's not a whole lot of concrete examples of the things that you've done. So a lot of just flowery, they're a great person, they contribute a lot, but beyond that, there's not really much about what you did contribute. So I think one thing, that I said, before was that when you're having this conversation with your recommender, don't be shy and really reminding them of the projects that you've worked on and what your specific contribution to those projects were. I think that will be really helpful as they're, again, saying all this flowery language, but then also going into, examples of it. And don't be shy in letting them know that one of the things that we really would like to see are, not just, who you are and those adjectives that describe you, but tell us about, how that's put into practice.
Great, thank you. I'll send this one over to Jared. What should reapplicants keep in mind as they approach this application cycle?
Oh yeah, well, thank you. We love reapplicants. And I think one of the saddest realities for us is that we receive more qualified, fantastic applicants in any given year than we have the space to admit. And so we really do encourage you to reapply if it did not result in an offer of admission in 1 year. As for how you construct your application, I think just at a very high level, if you submit the same application as you did in the year before, you can probably expect about the same result. By and large, it's hard to predict from one round to the next. And so, sort of take that with a little bit of a caveat. But I would also encourage you to reach out to the admissions committee. I think we're one of the very few schools who will offer application feedback. There's a limited window for it. We wait until the complete cycle is closed in the previous year and before the next one has opened, or we've gotten too far into it. But do reach out for application advice. But really just think holistically about, are there components of your application otherwise that you can improve upon, because the committee will have access to your previous application.
Great. And I think we'll need to pause there. I apologize for not getting to all the great questions that were coming through, but I hope we'll have other opportunities to engage. Encourage you to sign up for an admissions Q&A. We host several of them every week. We have next Friday coming up, the next installment of our summer faculty series, and so you can sign up to join us virtually for that. Thank you to all of our panelists for joining today. Thank you for Melissa for working with the questions behind the scenes. Thank you to all of you for joining us. I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you to my kids for not participating in this conversation. I'll have to share that after we get off today. And looking forward to seeing many of your applications in the coming cycle and getting to know all of you a little bit better. Take care, everyone, and stay well.